Welcome to episode 4 of the Crackpot podcast with James LaFond and Lynn Lockhart. This episode was taped July 5th and will be presented in 4 parts. You're listening to part 2. It's so interesting because one day I was talking to someone who's originally from Ohio, and she was talking about the DAR. I said, what's that? What's DAR? She told me it's Daughters of the American Revolution. And it's just something that you guys have over there, which is people that have long roots in one place. And here in California, especially where I live, everybody's not been here very long. My parents were immigrants, and my neighbors on both sides are immigrants themselves, and more than half the people I worked with when I was working were recent immigrants. So it's so interesting to talk to people who have long history where they are.
It's interesting living in an area like that because you do have this history, and you also have an inability to remember the history because most of the people that stayed are really idiots, and they haven't really been able to preserve their heritage. So there's a lot of digging to be done, and I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of genealogy research, and it's amazing how quickly you can just forget. My mom has maybe a dozen cousins, and she can't name them all, and she's in her 60s, and she'll sit here, I'll call so and so, and they'll tell me, but she can't remember. Well, she left her home country about 40 years ago and hasn't seen these people in that time. So to be fair, it's been a long time, but that kind of family history gets lost really easily, is what I have learned from doing genealogical research in my own family.
Most of mine is lost. I have a patchy bit of information, and I myself pretty much just care about my paternal ancestors, and to the effect that I know of any of the other ones, it's an accident.
Your kids might care, though. They might be interested.
Honestly, I've been far more interested in the history of other people than the history of my people, because the evidence that they stayed here in Baltimore as members of the working class, it doesn't promise a lot of revelations. But I will eventually get into it if I last long enough.
Oh, there's no chance you're like a long lost prince of some realm.
Nah, there's probably a pretty nasty overseer, whipcracker, in my Irish lineage. It was interesting that the Irish women, my grandmother was, I think it was one of 6 or 7, and only one of them, my Uncle Joe, was a guy. The rest of them were all very attractive women who married outside of their ethnicity. They're marrying Germans, whatever, anything but marrying an Irish guy. So.
Do you think that's uncommon? Do you think that it would have been more expected for them to look among the Irish community?
Why would they?
Yeah, I don't know.
The Irish guys that were any good probably got the hell out of town and moved to the mountains or kept going. These guys that I ran into, I didn't run into them. They invited me out. Ishmael and his people, they came from the same groups of Scottish and Irish and English that I did, but their people moved out during waves of really hazardous migration.
Okay.
It makes them a lot different than, the good slave stock that I came from.
Yeah.
So when the women try to marry up and out of that, particularly they were marrying largely into German immigrant families, guys that were Catholic Rhinelanders that were pretty much being driven out. They were descendants of people that had some of their numbers sold off to George Washington a century before. They were starting businesses when they got to Baltimore. My great-grandfather's parents, there's a picture of him standing in 1910, I think, in a garden. And I knew him. He lived to be almost 100 years old, buried 4 wives. Wow. His parents opened a pudding factory in Baltimore. And there's a picture of him after his first wife passed away early, standing behind a couch where these two pairs of middle-aged Germans with the two grandfathers having those big sweeping sideburns, and my grandfather and his brothers standing at their knees. And he was standing, my great-grandfather was standing behind them. That was the family that my great-grandmother married into. So that's, the correlation now wouldn't be the same because you don't have people with capital that are the same race as you coming from other countries.
Right.
Now it would be
nobody's coming from Europe anymore, really much. And it's also interesting to think about that most Americans are really mongrelized Europeans, and that's something kind of new and different compared to Europe, where there really are real distinctions between people.
Well, our mongrelization was intentional. It was done as much as possible. I know my grandmother, Alberta Roy, absolutely hated the English. Her father, Alzire, was an English orphan who was sold to French people as a servant, and she just couldn't. Apparently, he passed this animus down to her. She couldn't let it go. She was a very gentle woman, but you couldn't talk about the English or the British around her.
Some of that even made it to you, I think. You're no fan of the English.
Well, maybe so. Although I have often played the British in various war games, and I think I do pretty good as a mildly skilled general with a lot of tenacity and a great appetite for throwing my own men away.
Yeah.
I think I put myself well as a British general.
I had another follow-up, but it slipped my mind.
We're supposed to talk about the wildebeest crime counting mentality.
Yeah,
correct?
yes, let's get to that.
We digressed by many stages from that.
Well, that makes good radio, I think. So you've talked many times about this concept where the FBI and other of our ruling bodies report crime statistics usually as a proportion of population, crimes, this crime or that crime per 100,000. Yeah. And you won't be surprised to learn that I have been reading more from Taleb. And this is kind of his specialty, is looking at these kind of statistics in a way that's not so naive, where if you just say that your risk is such and such per 100,000, and then people will say, oh, well, you have more chance of getting bitten by a shark than you have of getting killed in a terrorist attack, let's say. And that's why we need more Muslim immigration. Well, it's you don't get bitten by a shark unless you go swimming, right? And so people it's like you're not allowed to draw this distinction that it's not just crime per 100,000. It's not just shark bites. It matters who you're with and where you are and what you're doing. And that's a point that you've made over and over, too.
Well, if we want to go with the shark analogy, if you want your people to feel threatened and hence feel a great need for your benevolent protection, then you would like to give them no excuse not to go swimming with the sharks, particularly not while they're menstruating. So if you want people to live in deep fear of sharks and look to their masters to fix this for them, you want to encourage them to swim with the sharks while they're bleeding. The forerunners of our masters at this time on this continent used to send out these sailing ships, these little boats that would bobble on the water. They were very top heavy. They tried to put too many guns on one of them, and it fell over and it sank right as it was coming out of the Thames under Henry VIII's reign. Well, the masters on the ship would get to do their business in a pot, in a chamber pot in their room, and their little cabin boy would take that out and he would dump it over the side. But all of the sailors had to climb out onto this little perch. It was 3 little wooden words that attached this little wooden ring to the edge of the ship. You're 2 stories above the heaving ocean on this thing that's bobbing back and forth. You have to climb out on this thing, and you've got to go to the bathroom while sitting on this ring.
Oh
And it's very easy to fall off of this. At the same time, the ships are being trailed by sharks, partially because there's all this human waste going into the water here, and sharks do a lot of traveling between areas that are completely barren of prey as they cross the oceans. And these guys, a lot of them are bleeding from the nether regions because they have a zero-fiber diet, and they're highly constipated. They're eating salted meat, and they're eating moldy hardtack, and they're drinking rum. And many of these fellows going to the bathroom on that thing fell to their death to the sharks that were waiting below them. Now, eventually, this became known as the head. More civilized sea captains in the future, when you had regular military services, designed a set of holes that you could sit on, partially enclosed by the structure of the ship, at the head of the ship. And will still sit there. They're going to the head. They're hitting the head because that's where they want to go to the bathroom. But for the first couple hundred years of the age of sail, they're perched on the side of the ship a couple stories up, trying, relieve themselves. God forbid they relieve themselves in the captain's pot. Then it would be hell to pay. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there.
No, that's okay. I was going to add to it, but I think we should not. But, so I have to say that there has to be some simple way of reporting statistics, and they do it with those very broad numbers because that's just an easy and simple way. But, the side effect is that they're really hiding more than they're reporting in those 100K.
Well, they're not reporting it for us. They're reporting it for them. If you own a flock of sheep, you want to know how many are going to die on the range out on the pasture.
Yeah.
To the extent that some of them are killed by wolves, that's good because that helps keep them flocked together. You even have your own wolves that you send after them to keep them in line. Part of the effectiveness of the sheepdog has to do with the fact that, he's a descendant of the predator that preyed upon the sheep, and the sheep recognize this.
Right. Yeah, they still have that sense of fear because it's part wolf.
Yeah, so we have the police to keep us in line. If you're a taxpayer, the police are there to keep you in line, and they're also there to keep the non-taxpayer from damaging tax-paying businesses.
Right. They're
not there to keep the non-taxpayer from damaging the taxpayer. Indeed, that non-taxpayer he's the guerrilla force. He's the ununiformed auxiliary to that police force when they work together.
And it even goes back, I think, and has some connection to the whole banking cartel and Federal Reserve because the taxpayer himself isn't really a key portion of the picture because the non-taxpayer is more valuable as a unit of federal funds. Thank you for listening to part 2 of episode 4 of the Crackpot podcast with James LaFond and Lynn Lockhart.